In this episode, we're going to take a step into the unknown. It's time to talk about the null value is a placeholder for missing or not applicable information. Its inventor, Sir Tony Hoare, has famously described it as his billion-dollar mistake. Why? Because using it brings huge complications to your code. Without null, when you compare two values, the result is either true or false. For example, are these two toys the same color? Yep, that's true. Or what about these two? Do these weigh the same? No, that's false. But null introduces a third state, unknown. So what happens when you use this? To make our cuddly toys here, we need to know how much stuffing to put in them to give them their nice, soft, squishy cuddliness. But stuffing is an invalid property of bricks. We're storing both of them in the same table, so what will we put in the quantity of stuffing column for bricks? Now, we could use 0, but that's not really right. It's an invalid property of bricks. What we can do to say that it doesn't apply is store null instead. This brings you headaches when writing your SQL. Statements only process rows where the where clause is true. If the result is false or unknown, the database doesn't process it. Now, if we're asking if the penguin here has the same quantity of stuffing as the brick, this kind of makes sense. Clearly they don't. So the fact that the SQL doesn't return it is alright. But let's ask a different question. What if we're asking if the penguin has more stuffing than the brick? Now, intuitively, the answer is yes. The penguin here has loads, the brick here has none. But if we're saying that this value is greater than null, the answer is unknown, and so the row isn't returned. You can overcome this by using the isNull condition. As well as checking whether or not the penguin's here stuffing is greater than the quantity of stuffing for the brick, you also need to check that the penguin's stuffing is not null and that the brick's is null. And do this and you'll get the correct answer. But if you're comparing more than a couple of columns, this quickly makes your SQL much more complicated. You can simplify this by mapping nulls to real values. MVL is an Oracle-supplied function which returns the second argument if the first is null. So you can use this to map the quantities of stuffing to 0. This allows you to compare the columns correctly. Or you can use the anti-compliant coalesce. This has some subtle differences to MVL, but a key one is that coalesce can take any number of arguments, whereas MVL is limited to just 2. There are a host of other null-related functions available which can make working with these values easier. But whatever you do, your SQL is more complicated and it's more likely you'll make a mistake. So perhaps Sir Tony Hoare was right, and that null has led to $1 billion worth of errors. So we're best off avoiding it. But what can you do instead? In an effort to avoid null, many people use magic values instead. These are special out-of-bounds values which are impossible in your real data. For example, you can't have a negative amount of stuffing for a brick. So to say that the property doesn't apply, we can store the brick's quantity of stuffing as -1. At first glance, this seems to solve the problems with null. If we're comparing the quantity of stuffing for our penguin to the quantity of stuffing for the brick, we're back to standard two-valued logic and we get the results we expect. But using magic values can bring complications to your code elsewhere. For example, say we want to sum up the total quantity of stuffing used for all our toys. You'll subtract 1 for each brick you have in your table, giving the wrong answer. Similar problems exist for other aggregate functions such as averages, standard deviations, and so on. While the solution is easy, just add a where clause excluding the magic values, this is easy to forget, particularly if they are rare or look like they could be real values in your data. So new developers joining your team may not be aware that these values have special meaning. You need to teach everyone joining your team what your magic values are and how they work so your application will function correctly. At least Null is publicly documented and will work the same way across different systems. You also need to ensure that your impossible magic values really are impossible. In 1979, Robert Barber applied for personalized license plates. He entered his first two choices as sailing and boating. He didn't have a third choice, but instead of leaving this line in the form blank, he entered no plate. It turned out that his first two choices were already taken, and so the DMV issued him with license plates containing the text, "No plate." So he ended up with personalized plates that he didn't really want. But the problems don't stop there. Turns out that when parking officers were issuing tickets for illegally parked vehicles, if they didn't have a license plate, they would enter the registration as "no plate." And when these tickets were processed and entered into the system, they would match with Robert Barber's. So he soon started receiving a flood of parking tickets from all across the country. Remember, if there's any chance that your magic values turn out to be real, valid values, you're opening up the possibility of new, even stranger bugs than if you just used Null in the first place. Use these with extreme caution. Dealing with Null is a thorny issue. We covered some of the key points here, but as we'll discover in future episodes, most SQL operations have their own gotchas and caveats when it comes to using Null. Through careful table design, you can reduce your need to use Null. For all columns that should have a real value, ensure you add a not null constraint on them. This will stop null values accidentally creeping into your data. But dealing with missing or not applicable information is a problem that never really goes away. However you choose to deal with it, whether that's null or magic values, ensure that when you test your application, you include rows with these properties. So that was a quick overview of Null in Oracle Database. I hope you enjoyed this, but more importantly, I hope you learned something. If you found this useful and like my style, then please subscribe to be informed of future videos, or click the links on the screen to see some of my existing content. And thanks for watching.